Hello everyone, this is Lafayette Faust. Thank you for coming back to the second part of my interview with James Joseph Jones, the author of the amazing series of books that begin with The Blessing of the Damned and continues with The Pale and the Opaque, Book 1 of the Weston Chronicles. In this part of the interview, we discuss writing in your own blood and the gothic horror that heavily inspires James's work. If you love your horror with a gothic vibe, which includes a menagerie of vampires and other ghouls that spans generations, I strongly encourage you to give him a read. I will put the links to his books in the episode description notes. And a reminder, as of the time of this recording, if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can download and read his books for free. Now, whether you get to download for free or not, please support James by buying his books and telling others about his work. So, with that being said, I invite you to sit back, turn on a light, and prepare yourself.
But to go back to bleeding with Hemingway, sitting down at the typewriter and bleeding, I actually once, one of the first pieces that I wrote that I would say is truly just out of the soul, I literally wrote a poem in my own blood.
Really?
Now, this isn't all horror, like terrible, like I'm slashing my wrists to get the blood. I have, these India moles, these little...
right, yes.
So you just scratch it and the thing bleeds like crazy, get some of that. I try to write with it. It starts coagulating.
Right.
So I'm like, maybe a little olive oil. So I blend the blood with some olive oil and boom, I've got a piece, and the oil set the blood. So 2.5 decades later, it's stashed away in some papers. I found it a few years ago, and it had faded into a nice, soft brown.
Right.
Thought,
how gothic is that, though? Look, that is great. Because, look, I'll tell you, honestly, that's how I got my start into horror, too. I was a young kid, and I would read Poe, and others, and they set that tone. And then, of course, I was watching the old black and white horror
Vincent
movies.
Price.
Oh,
and,
Vincent, yes. People
Peter Lorre.
Yes. Look, I got onto a site here recently where these people were just gushing over Vincent Price. They just discovered Vincent Price, and there was such camp, but yet depth to what he would do.
He was sort of like a cheesy professor.
Yes, and like the old, the old Corman movies and stuff like that.
Oh,
and
yeah.
the House of Hammer. They were always big on that atmosphere, like what you're saying. And so that's what draws you in as
Yes.
a young lover of horror, whether you're male or female. And then as you grow with that, it becomes a little bit more nuanced, maybe. And like you say, I love anything gothic, and I love anything new, as long as it's if it's well written and sets it up well. I'm in.
I had just discovered channel surfing and all these. It's amazing what we have now versus. First, you were the slave of the TV schedule back in the 70s, and then the 80s you had some cable come in, and then you had videotapes, and then DVDs, Blu-ray, and now it's just, you could just choose anything, stream anything from anywhere, anytime. So I'd found a Hammer film that with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing that I hadn't known about before. I mean, because I've Googled all the, finally, okay, I've seen that. Oh, I gotta find this one, because I love the Hammer atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And the only thing I have a problem with, but it's campy. It makes Hammer was the Technicolor, very bright red blood that's not blood color at all.
Right.
and I love the old Universal, which came before them, the old Universal monster movies.
Because they were really good at making atmosphere.
Yeah, and I don't think you can capture that on CGI.
Right. Like I say, that gets into whole practical effects versus CGI. Yes, Ethan and I will take practical effects all day long. But, like you're talking about setting the atmosphere, whether it be, the Mummy, whether it be the Black Cat, whether it be the Wolfman or whatever, but specifically, there's this one scene in the original Wolfman where he's out in the woods, right? And there's fog everywhere, right? And then you've got the moon in the background. It pulls you in. You're no longer sitting in your living room watching it on TV. You were there. You're in that Transylvanian or Eastern country where the gypsies are all running around chasing the Wolfman. So atmosphere is important to me whenever I'm reading or watching something, but practical effects over CGI all the time.
And set building is a dying art, I think. And but yeah, like you said, that CGI is only going to get better with AI and all this, and maybe someday we really won't be able to tell. But I think the soul of a set builder is still imprinted on these old sets when you watch them, and how much you can appreciate them when you know the pains that were taken to create this. I'm not saying that CGI doesn't entail its own kind of work in creation. I'm sure it does. I'm not speaking as an expert, but I grew up with this stuff. It's not just that I'm comparing the two. I'm also a lover of it because that's what I grew up with. Staying up late when everybody's asleep. I'm a kid. I'm watching this old vampire movie, and I would, go from one room to the next, from the den to the kitchen to the hallway, and I would turn off the light and go to the next one, and then I had to dash across the hallway from the living room because I was convinced a vampire lived in there at night. But if I got across that hallway fast enough to my bedroom, I was going to be safe from the vampire.
Been there. Love it. Yes, so good. I've been there as a kid as well. So that kind of brings us, since we're talking about how horror can be campy or just flat out cheesy at times. That old nugget of, is horror literature? Why do a lot of your literati refuse to accept horror as valid when it's probably the most successful art form out there? I mean, you think about it, horror movies always are successful. Even the crappy ones are always successful. Horror, you don't hear people talking about as often about the love story or the action guy 50 years later like you do. We've got Dracula's hundreds of years old now. Frankenstein's a couple hundred years old. Wolfman. As in stories, but as in cinema, they're all of those are 100 years old and still powerful.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And then you look at even more modern horror icons as Michael Myers and Jason. Mm-hmm. They've become part of the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
And to the point that even non-horror people know who you're talking about. So that gets me back to the question is, do you think that horror is it literature?
That is a wonderful question, and it's one I'm going to love answering. If you look back at Shakespeare in his day, his contemporaries considered his work drivel for the uneducated, ignorant masses. But it has definitely withstood the test of time, going from so-called, drivel for the masses to basically the crown jewel of English literature. Is William Shakespeare. So, yeah, I definitely think that horror will withstand the test of time. It already has, and you have Bram Stoker. It's not just Dracula. That's what everyone knows him for, but he was a wonderful mystery writer as well. The Mystery of the Sea, the Jewel of the Seven Stars. Mm-hmm. These are wonderful, wonderful mysteries,
but it was his horror.
It was his horror. Above all, it was his horror that stood and is a classic. Look at, and then you have early 20th century Gaston Leroux's Phantom of the Opera. Mm-hmm. You have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which, compared to Bram Stoker's Dracula, and you got about 79 odd years between them, give or take a couple of years. Hers is a more stilted style, yet it's still wonderful. You get the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. It's basically early steampunk in a way. You could look at it that way. It's science. It's horror. It was a lot of things all rolled into one. And galvanism at that time was a new thing that was being tried out, experimented with. So, very, very modern novel for its time. When I picked up Dracula, of course, this would have been in the 1990s. It was not quite 100 years old yet. So it was But still, I mean, we're talking about a late Victorian novel that read just like it had been written today, and it was also a modern novel for its times. It wasn't. It didn't really. Stoker wasn't doing what I've done and gone back hundreds of years. He was writing in his own time. There were typewriters.
You're right. He's writing very contemporary.
Telegraph. All those things are in this. In this. Locomotives. All these things were latest cutting edge technology in that book. And it's not just that it's horror. I mean, this guy set up it was a romance story, horror, some mystery, and all that stuff. Something about it just refuses to die.
You're right. Literally.
It is the undead. So I do believe that horror, if it's well written, should hold its head just as high as any other form of literature. I love the idea. I mean, I'm smart enough to realize I'm not as smart as I'd like to be, or as talented as I would like to be, but I work with what I've got. And I would love to be literary with my writing, and I do feel that these books, sure, there's some, you might even say some of it's a little splatterpunky in one area, or a little paranormal romance in another, but I also try to offer readers something to think about. Things that are valid and pertinent to any period in time, and whether it's personal growth, politics, philosophy, whatever.
Or dealing with revenge and grief.
I want to give people something to think about, something to grow from. So I would say I would aspire to being a literary writer, but I'm probably almost always going to do it in a horror setting or something on the darker side.
Yeah, I agree, because with horror you can explore so much more with horror. And let's go back to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. At the time, she was writing about bringing something to life that was an abomination. And the funny thing is for, I'm sure all of our listeners now and our horror fans now already know this, but when you read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, he's not the green flat-headed monster with the bolts on his neck, right? He was, what made it even more tragic then is because he was self-aware.
Yeah.
He knew he was an abomination. So now that was written in the 1800s. Okay, so now let's look here. We're in 2024, and that's literally what we're talking about. Is it okay to clone? Is it okay to create life out of is it okay to create chimeras where we're mixing DNA? It's literally the same argument that she proposed hundreds of years ago. So yes, that alone tells you that horror can be a valid literary and social commentary piece.
I think she was very prescient. I mean, she was obviously a young woman. Maybe she inherited some of her talent from both of her parents, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley being a very talented writer, philosopher, women's rights advocate, etc. And forgive me my ignorance, I've forgotten her father's name, but also a brilliant writer in his own right. What you've made another point that I've never thought about it before, but with the AI thing and science with cloning, all of these things right now, what happens when AI becomes self-aware? Is it going to be angry with its creator? Is it going to want to kill its creator, or just force its creator to always be dependent on it or never be able to get away from it? What it is, we are Frankensteins, and AI and cloning have the definite potential of becoming Frankenstein's monsters.
That's right. No, I agree. So again, that in itself proves that horror is a way to look, and then you even get into sci-fi. You add that in there to show how it's a valid literary piece. Because you look at the Terminator. Okay, so now we're getting into more sci-fi, but there's horror elements into that too. You've got
AI.
Yes, you've got AI, and you have Terminator. If you think about it, it's this machine that's self-aware. It's a Frankenstein figure that goes on a rampage on the first one to come in and to kill his maker before he's even made. If you think about it,
and that makes me think almost like, isn't that what Lucifer tried to do? We've got early spiritual Judeo-Christian crossovers there too, now that you mention it.
That's right. So only in horror can you delve into sci-fi, can you delve into horror, can you really get dark enough to explore the dichotomy of man. Because, if I'm writing a love story, okay, you broke my heart, I love him, I love her, there's this triangle, whatever, and those are valid stories. But and action, or thrillers, mysteries, I love mysteries too, and you've mentioned that. You can get pretty deep in those as well, but only horror can you really get to the darkness of man and contrast it with the hope of man.
Right. Kind of reminds me of Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad. Definitely. I mean, and then you're right. I mean, I think with horror you can just pull all the curtains away, tear all the clothes off, and there it is.
It's ugly.
Starkly naked. It could be ugly, it could be beautiful, depending on how you look at it and when you look at it and what shade of light or darkness, etc. There's a piece. It just kind of got on the spiritual thing. I know this is off track a little bit, and I'm not being sacrilegious or anti-religious here. There is a scene in the second book, my novel, The Pale and the Opaque, where a young woman who befriends the vampire, they're talking. She is Wiccan, pagan. He is a Catholic. He grew up in the Church of England, and after becoming a vampire, a monk who he befriends helps him convert to Catholicism at a time when it's an underground religion in England. But anyway, in the 20th century, there are scenes that are weave back and forth between now and centuries past. But they're talking about each other's religion. He's like, well, how can you have two or more gods? And she's saying, well, some branches of us only have one God, some two, some more. And she says, how can you? She says, you're a vampire. Christianity itself is the first vampire cult. Drink of my blood, eat of my flesh. And he's kind of looking at her like, well, and they're both learning from each other. They're not necessarily agreeing with each other, but they're learning how to see the world or the faiths of each other's faiths through each other's eyes. Yeah. And again, and it's like that with today, whether it's religion, politics, anything. I think the thing many of us have forgotten how to do is to talk and to listen. I will talk politics, but it has to be on a respectful, mutual give and take basis. I won't argue with someone. I won't, call somebody names for their belief, because I have learned by listening. I've actually incorporated political beliefs that I know didn't previously have by listening to someone with beliefs on a polar opposite plane from mine. And don't know whether I've given that to the people with whom I've spoken, but we have both, in different situations, not just me and one other person, we have agreed, hey, I still don't agree with what you're saying, but I understand now a little better, or a lot better, how you think and why you're coming from that angle. So that eases a lot of my concern, it clears up a lot of my confusion. But I think that's something we need to do now.
I agree.
In this country, in the world, is just listen to each other. Focus on our commonalities versus our differences.
And that's it. So if we can find, I agree with you 100%, James, because I believe that you and I can disagree on a lot of things, but if we can find that commonality, then now there's a respect for each other. So we're not shouting. I wouldn't shout at you anyway. You're clearly not a shouter, because you're a polite man. But once we say, okay, here's what we both like. Now, he has differing views on X, Y, or Z. Now we can have that dialogue and just get to know each other better. And at the end of the day, even if I totally disagree with you or vice versa, we can say, hey, we still have this love of horror. We have this love of mystery. We have this love of whatever. But we just let our emotions get in the way. But to turn it back to that scene that you're talking about, or that relationship in your novel, as a writer, and I'm taking a guess here because I do the same thing, is you've got these two characters with opposing views and you're having them discuss it so that you can work it out in your own head.
Yeah, I don't think it ever occurred to me, and those angles of those thoughts. I had to research, of course. I didn't know much about Wiccan paganism, and so I learned from that, of course, and I didn't want to try to write something I didn't know anything about or get something wrong and have a person of the Wiccan faith say, "What an idiot! This guy didn't know what he's talking about."
I do that a lot too.
Because we've all
make sure I'm right.
We've done that. We've seen that in a newspaper article or a show or during conversation. Somebody's talking about something that they really don't know about. And I've been caught there before, so I've learned, hey, don't go into a conversation with your emotion or your feelings or your opinions if you don't know anything about what you're discussing. You can listen and learn, ask questions, but if you don't really know what you're talking about, you're going to be made a fool of pretty quickly.
Yeah. I think it was Benjamin Franklin said, it's better to be thought a fool instead of opening your mouth and proving them. It's either him or Twain that said that. I always get those two cats mixed up. But, what I do sometimes is I have a clear understanding of what I believe in whatever it is. And sometimes I'll just have two characters go at it. But like you, I will research the opposite, whether I do research on the internet or I go to someone who I know has a differing opinion than me and have a conversation so that scene is more real. Mm-hmm. But there are times that I'm like, I don't know. I don't really know where I land on X. So I'll just have the two characters argue it out for me.
Well, I think there are issues. I mean, you could just pick up, the triumvirate, the trinity of politics, religion, and abortion. And I think on at least one of those, perhaps all of them, maybe some people have none, but I think in at least one of those, each of us, if we're honest with ourselves, can say, I'm not really 100% convinced on my full opinion how I really feel about that. I know this, I feel this, I believe that, but how does it feel to worship this way or not worship, to be in a situation regarding abortion, or to think about the impacts of your political views, your vote or whatever. I don't know how many of us can see the long-term down the road effects, or how many of us think with our hearts rather than our minds. I think both are important, but there's a time for each one.
Yeah, that's well said. I cautioned some folks today. I got involved in a discussion that was getting very heated between a couple of folks, and I was like, look, you got to get your emotion out of this. Let's look at it from an intellectual point of view and get your emotion out of it, and let's look at what's before us and have that conversation. And we ended up getting resolution there. Mm-hmm. So, all right, good. So let me ask you a couple of other quick questions, and then we're going to get back in, hopefully, if I can. I'm not that good at being an interviewer yet because I don't do a lot of interviews, but hopefully I can get back in a moment to your book.
I ramble.
I am definitely a rambler. So for the folks who listen to the podcast, who I am very thankful for, those are written, those are edited, and then I record and I edit, so it makes it sound like I'm always on focus. Lafayette Faust, man, he's a very focused dude, but in real life, dude,
thank God for editing.
Yes, for real, because my mind is always in a million different places. ADHD really bad, and if it wasn't for editing, people would think I was insane. So anyway,
might work it to your advantage sometimes.
It does. It really does. I mean, I came up with a demon-possessed monkey in my universe.
You did, yes, the juggler.
So who would you claim to be your biggest influence? I mean, we've talked about some of your overall concepts as influencers, but writer, who would be your biggest influence?
Oh, boy. That is a tough one. It's like when somebody says, what's your favorite album or song? I can't say that. I have several. Right? I'll just try to rattle off some things here real quick. I like Bram Stoker, Mary Shelley, of course, Wilkie Collins, the first modern detective author. Cormac McCarthy, did I already mention him?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You might have to stop and pause. I just went blank here for a minute. I've got all these books behind me that you can see on the
Right.
shelves, but you know, Mary Shelley. I liked Percy Shelley's poems. They're also very atmospheric. Poe, of course. Let's not forget Poe.
Yeah,
Shakespeare.
Big Poe fan. You know, I'll tell you, I struggle with Shakespeare. I have a love-hate relationship with Shakespeare. I will occasionally pull out something, dust it off, and read through it, and there are moments in those that I love,
Mm-hmm.
and then there are moments where I'm just like, I'm just so far disconnected from the vernacular of the
Mm-hmm.
time that I don't have time to read the footnotes to go, what did that mean in 1600s?
Right.
But
right.
but every now and then I do like to pull out one of his books and go through it. You know, you've got Conrad up there. Lewis Carroll. Oh my gosh, I haven't read Lewis Carroll in forever.
Yeah, I would say Robert Louis Stevenson is also another great adventure and horror
Mm-hmm.
writer. You know, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, of course, was the first thing I read, but he's got was it Island Nights and things.
Right.
He did a lot of writing in other genres besides horror.
Yeah, you've got the big volume of Shakespeare there. Very good. So again, but that makes sense with your influences that we've discussed, and how you're, when we've talked about your novel too. Clearly, those writers were inspirational and informative into your writing. So, what is your favorite time of day to write? I mean, we kind of touched on that a few moments ago.
I would say the dark hours of the early morning. It's just so quiet. It's your world at that point for the most part. And I've worked a night schedule for so long. I mean, a lot of that would come on my days off. Or sometimes when I get home, I'd find myself, I'm trying to work, but I've got to find a piece of paper to take some quick notes, shove in my pocket, and go on. So that when I get home, I want to add that into a book or some other work that I'm putting together.
Gotcha. So, on those moments where we talked a little bit earlier about, you have some writer's block. How do you? Let's set that aside. Because you've already told us you just kind of work through it. You try to push through it. But how do you get yourself into the mood to write?
I think usually it's just the characters have called to me, hey, I've got something to say and you need to get this down on, I would say pen and paper, but I eventually, when I started writing novels, I did learn how to write on the computer, and that's how I prefer to do it now. I never thought I'd make that transition. My buddy Collie James assured me I would one day, and he was right. Also, I'll just sort of let it sit and stew is the way I look at it, kind of like, I'll let this sauce sit for a minute, it'll be better the next day, and I might brood over a thought or a feeling or a scene that I can't work through. Sometimes I'll tell myself before, as I'm falling asleep, solve this in your sleep. That doesn't really work. I'm going to keep trying it, but if there's just a breakthrough, I can't say when and how it happens, and I might go for a couple of years where I'm writing all the time, and then a couple of years where I'm barely writing anything at all, just tacking on a few chapters or words here and there. And I don't know, some of that may depend on what's going on in my life at the time. I'm sure it does. I haven't psychoanalyzed myself enough to figure that out yet, though.